Today I uploaded my 5-hour in-depth flower study tutorial over on Patreon, and as a thank you for the wonderful support here I still receive daily on YouTube, I thought I would now share an hour-long snippet of that tutorial here. If at any point you would like to watch the full tutorial and many others, you can find the link to my Patreon with over 2,000 members in the description. We'll start this snippet just before the fourth step in the tutorial. So as we move on to the flowers themselves, I thought the first 3 we work on here would be a great way to test out a few different methods. This is just to show you some different ways in which you can work so that you can see which option may suit your practice the best. I'll just quickly give you a quick overview of the 3 different ways now before we get started. So for this first yellow flower here, I'm going to create a detailed base layer followed by a detailed pencil layer on top. So straight away I'm aiming to accurately get the correct colours and values for each of the petals straight away in the base layer, and then simply continue to build upon and refine the base layer with pencils straight after. So with this method, more time is spent and focus is put on getting the accurate base layer first before moving on to our pencil refinement. For the second pink flower here, we're going to outline each of the petals with a graphite pencil, and then for our base layer, we're going to essentially fill in the general darkest values and vibrant colours that we can see in the reference image. So not focusing on each individual petal in the base layer, but the overall general appearance. So then those graphite outlines will allow us to see through this initial base layer so that we can still see the exact positions of the petals. Then we can create all of the individual petal refinements and highlights on top with our pastel pencils for all of the detail and definition. This method pays less attention to the base layer and more effort is put into the pencil refinements, made possible by still seeing the graphite outlines through the general base layer. For the third and final method here, for this white flower to the far right, we're just going to skip the soft pastels and the base layer altogether and just go straight in with our pastel pencils. So then once all 3 flowers are done, we can compare and contrast the different ways to see which works best for us personally. My aim for doing this is just to demonstrate to you that there are different methods and techniques of tackling each and every pastel piece that you may wish to work on. And once all 3 methods are tested, I can then continue the other flowers with whatever method works best for me, and I encourage you to do the same for whatever method works best for you too. So as I just mentioned in the intro, this first method will put a lot of focus on getting more accuracy in the initial base layer, so I want to have the most accurate colours possible. And for this I'm going to put down different shades of yellows and oranges on my scrap Pastelmat board, and then I'm going to transfer over these colours just like we did with the previous leaf base layer. So you can see I've just wiped off the excess green pigment that's embedded into my sponge from the leaves, and now I can pick up these yellow and orange colours without the worrying of muddying my colours. We're not going to have every specific colour that we need in our pastel collection, so using the blendability of pastels to our advantage like this is really handy for colour accuracy. So first here I'm adding in that deep orange colour that we can see in the centre of the flower, and then I'm going to move on to filling in the pigments for the petals themselves. So for the petals, I'm going to start in some of those darker and more shadowed areas just while we have those darker pigments embedded into the sponge already. So here you can see I'm picking up some of these dark orangey brown and mixing it with a lighter yellow with the aim of achieving that same shadowed colour that I can see in the reference. As I add these pigments in, however, I noticed that this colour mixture needs a slightly more green tone added to it, so luckily I already have some green pigments on my scrap Pastelmat board, so here you can see I can just pick up some of these green pigments into the mixture, and this is given a more accurate sort of mossy yellow colour that I can see in the shadowed petals. Again, if you're struggling with the colour accuracy, it's always helpful to use some sort of colour picking tool. So with the same colour mixture, I can carefully go in between and start to fill out all of these shadow petals that I can see, mainly to the left of the flower, being careful not to fill in those lighter yellow petals that are in front. The area we're filling in is relatively small, so it does help to use the tip of the sponge head as much as possible, just for that extra control and precise placement. Okay, so that's some of the most shadow petals added in, and now we can move on to some of these more mid-tone petals where they're sort of in between being in the shadow and also catching the light. So here on my scrap Pastelmat board, I can just add in some lighter yellow pigments to my colour mixture just to lighten the value slightly. As we come into even lighter value areas, especially to some of these petals on the left here that you can see are catching the light quite a lot, I can just pick up more of that lighter yellow pigment here into my colour mixture. And if you're wondering what this yellow pigment is, it's the Grey 22 from Unison Colour. As always with my tutorials, I will list all of the specific pastel sticks and pencils used in an attached PDF. Okay, so transitioning back into some of these more slightly darker mid-tone colours, I'll pick up some more of this almost golden sand colour to create some of these shadows for the petals in front, and also to fill in more of the shadow petals behind. And then here I can also see some of that orange warmth coming through the petals as the light is bouncing from that orange centre, so I can incorporate some of these colours into my mixture here too. I'm just going in between those highlighted petals in front with the aim of being careful and not to overlap the outlines here, so still just mapping out where those darkest areas are. So here you can see that my colours are gradually getting lighter as the reference I can see lighter values, so I'm just constantly picking up lighter and lighter pigments into my mixture on my scrap Pastelmat board just to replicate the changes in the value that I see in the reference image here. So with this method we want the base layer to be accurate, but we will still do a lot of refining with our pencils afterwards, so it doesn't need to be 100% perfect, just a really good starting point before any pencil details go on top. So here you can see we now have some of those darker and lighter values next to each other, and we can start to see some of that definition and structure begin to emerge as the difference in values and colours makes us perceive that 3D depth, that there are some lighter petals catching the light in front compared to those darker shadowed petals behind. So quickly here I've just got some of that darker colour embedded into my sponge, and I'm just adding in some of those shadows that we see especially in the corners like so. So now I'm just going to fill out the rest of these lighter petals in front. Here you can see overall they're near enough the same colour, but we have those slightly darker values maybe to the edges and around the petals which give us that definition. It's not really possible to add the definition in the base layer for this particular area because the definition details are so small, such as those little shadows and slightly darker areas that we can see. Okay, so that's the detailed base layer completed, and now we can switch to our pencils to build upon the colours and definition that we've already put in place. So first here I'm using the Faber-Castell 180, which you can see is this lovely golden colour, and I'm just going to use it to enhance some of these shadowy colours to the petals here. This colour will complement the yellow and orange tones of the flower. I'm also going to use the much darker Carbothello 635 dark brown and also the Carbothello 610 warm brown, and begin to add in that definition even further by darkening those shadows. So this dark brown here is obviously too dark for the area, but this is just going to allow me to get that deep dark value for some of these shadows. And then in a second I can go on top with this lighter yellowy brown colour to mix and combine to create a lighter shadow colour. So hopefully you can see how I've just started with that dark value from the Carbothello and then paired it with the lighter brown for the accurate colour that I'm looking for. So I'm always thinking about what colours I can mix together to achieve not only the colour tone, but also the value of the colour. If I went straight in with the yellowy brown, the value alone wouldn't be dark enough, so I needed to pair it with the dark brown underneath for that correct value. I would say that this area is quite complicated as there's a lot of subtle changes to the shadows and highlights here, so my method is just to start to map out the shadows first for the definition, and then I will start to focus on the highlights afterwards. So filling in the shadows like this just allows me to better solidify the definition and sort of positioning of everything, and then once I'm happy with that, I can later commit to some of those highlights. In the central area of the flower here, you can see that there's a dark surrounding shadow all along the border where the petals meet. So here I'm just taking that dark brown Carbothello and just sort of shading in a circular motion to add in these darker values here. And it may look a bit messy at the moment, but we can begin to refine and neaten things up as we go along. I just want to get these darker values in first before we continue, just so that there's not any blank areas that are not covered by pigment. So switching back to some of the lighter browns here, I'm starting to draw in the gradient and transitions to give more of a 3D effect. So for the areas of the petals that are closer to the centre, they're usually darker, so in the corners especially you can see where the shadows are more intense. So I can just take some browns and start to fill in these gradients, again mixing and combining colours for the value and also the tone accuracy. Of course, as I've mentioned, pastels blend very easily together, so the work that we put in for the base layer is not lost, as those pigments will also lightly blend in and mix to combine with our pastel pencil pigments. So again, on top of the very dark Carbothello brown, I'll soften the shadows by also lightly shading in on top with the Conte A Paris 54, which you can see is this brown that has a slight yellow hue to it. You'll also notice that the more layers we start to add, the softer and less grainy the pastel appears to be. The paper we're working on, Pastelmat, can withstand many layers of pastels as long as you're using a light even pressure. If you press too hard and deposit too much pigment, either in the initial base layer or these pencil details, you're going to fill in the tooth of the paper too quickly, which makes it hard for more layers to go on top. And things might also start looking blotchy, so always use a light even pressure with your pencils as you're shading in new layers on top. So here I'm just continuing to enhance some of these shadows and darker values with the Conte A Paris brown before moving on to adding in some of the highlights. Okay, so the first pencil I'm using here to begin the highlights is the Carbothello 690, which you can see is this light yellow colour. Now this isn't the brightest yellow I'm going to use, as I'll be gradually working my way up through the layers to brighter and brighter pencils as I build up the depth. So with this pencil I'm first focusing on some of those lightest petals that we can see catching the light straight away, and also some of the lighter outer edges that outline a few of the petals in the slightly shaded areas. Essentially, I'm just looking back and forth the reference photo, starting to pick out where I can see those lighter yellow values and colours. Again, I'm using a light even pressure with my pencil as I still want to add more layers on top after this. And also, as I add in these highlights, it also gives me the opportunity to slightly correct the shape and maybe rectify some of the areas where the darker pencils have accidentally gone over the border. So just refining and neatening it up as I go along. So for example, you can see where I'm carving out the shape of some of these petals here, and in particular their outer edges, as that's exactly what I see happening in the reference image. So really I'm just breaking things down into their basic shapes and proportions. I'm not really thinking too hard about drawing actual petals here, but rather just really focusing on the reference photo and seeing where those lighter yellow colours are, and then just placing those marks on my artwork. Again, just like in the initial base layer, I can see some slight green hue to these yellow colours, especially in those shaded areas. So I'm just also very lightly shading in on top with the Faber-Castell 174, which you can see is this dark subtle green. I'm holding my pencil a bit further back to get a good view of where I'm shading, and this also just helps me to have a very light pressure, as I only want to very lightly and subtly shade in this green colour for the correction. These green pigments are going to gently mix in with the pastel that's already there to shift the tone to a slightly greener colour. If I press too hard, then these petals will just turn green, so it's important that I only use the lightest touch. So at the moment I can just notice that some of these shadows could be a little warmer, so here I'm opting to use the Conte Paris 1 to lightly shade in these warm brown pigments on top. When using the Conte Paris pencil, it's very important to really only use a light pressure, as they tend to be a very opaque brand of pastel pencil. They deposit their marks very easily, so if I just want to make these subtle adjustments, then it's important that I only use the lightest touch. So then switching back to the Carbothello Dark Warm Brown 625, again just to build upon those warmer shadow tones. I personally love using the Carbothello brand and typically reach for them most, as they are sort of in between being opaque and subtle, so it's a good middle ground for how intense they are. Pastel pencil brands such as Faber-Castell that contain a harder pastel core means that their pigments deposit less easily, so I find them to be great for shading in, for example, whereas other brands such as the Conte Paris as well as the Caran, they have a very soft pastel core and are therefore very opaque, as their marks deposit on the paper much easier. This is where varying pressures with your pastel pencil becomes important, but I also think it's such a positive aspect of soft pastels and pastel pencils that you have an extra variable when it comes to pressure, as it can affect our mark making in different ways, such as the opacity, which is not possible with other media. So as well as drawing in some of the highlighted outlines here, you can see that I'm also adding in some of the highlights in the middle where the petal folds and bends, and I'm going to do the same for the other petals to the top right as well. Okay, so to work even lighter in our next layer, I'm opting to use the light yellow Carbothello 692, and I'm simply just referring back and forth the reference image just to see where those lightest colours and values are. So again, it's mostly to the petals on the left side here, as well as some of the outer edges and the corners where some of the other petals are just catching the light. I'm using a light to medium pressure with this pencil for this. So with some of those lighter values added in, I'm going to now switch to a more vibrant yellow, and this is the Caran 35, which you can see is this ochre colour. And with this pencil, I'm just aiming to shade in some of the midtones, so the areas between some of the highlights and the shadows, where I can just see some more vibrant yellow tones in the reference image. Again, the Caran are a very opaque brand of pastel pencil, so if you're shading in like I am here, it's very important to use a light even pressure, just because they deposit their pigment very easily. And for what I'm doing now, I only want to lightly shade in on top to subtly include these pigments rather than cover what's already there. So again, it's all about the pressure when it comes to shading in with pastel pencils. Okay then, so to also complement some of the darker midtones here, I'm also lightly shading in with the Faber-Castell 180, just in light circular motions to also subtly add these tones into the mixture. Lightly shading in like this also helps to smoothen out the pastel and better incorporate some of the gradients together as we blend and mix in the pigments. I'll also then switch to using the green Faber-Castell 174, which we previously used, again just to shift the tone slightly to a greener hue as I see it in the reference image, and just by using a really light pressure with my pencil to mix and combine with what's already there rather than pressing hard and covering what's there. Okay, so I think the petals are looking good. They might not be quite as vibrant as the reference image, but I personally quite like the more subtle and less intense appearance. So feel free to make your version more vibrant if you wish to by going on top with even more vibrant pencils in another layer. But now I'm going to focus on the central area, first by using the dark brown Carbothello 635, and again just shading in those darker values for the shadows all around the edges where it meets the petal, mostly just by using a light circular motion. And then here you can see I'm also adding in those lovely colours that we see in the very middle, such as these greens and yellows here, and this is just sort of enhancing the initial base layer before we add in those textured dots on top. So I want to get those general colours in place before we start adding in the detail and definition. Here you can see I'm also shading in these lovely warm browns with the Conte Paris 1, and you can see this is helping to smoothen out the pastel to get rid of any graininess. Again, as we add more light layers on top, the pastel layers become more incorporated and smoother. So I'll just quickly continue with some of these yellows and greens, and in a second I'll start using the dark grey Faber-Castell 175, and with this pencil I'll just reinforce some of those darkest values before we commit to adding in the details on top. It's really important that our base layer is as accurate as it can be before we commit to the details on top, and this is because once those details are in place, it's going to be really hard to change or enhance the colours underneath. So I like to make sure that the base layer is as good as it can be before I commit to those details. Okay, so to begin with the detail and definition here, I'm first opting to use the yellow Faber-Castell 183 and just sort of dabbing in these dots in place to the left side here. So like with most things, I'm not thinking about what I'm actually drawing here. I'm just looking at the reference photo and trying to figure out the correct sizes of these dots and also what sort of a gap to leave between each one of them as well. We can see that the dots towards the center are smaller and have less space between them, so I will replicate that with the dots I place with my pencil. And then as we come to the outer edges, the dots become slightly bigger and the gaps between them become larger, so I'll also replicate that. You'll also notice that the dots to the left side are catching the light more and therefore have a lighter value, whereas the dots to the right side are more in the shadow and darker, so we can use a slightly darker pencil for those. And for these slightly darker dots here, I'm using the Carbothello 620. Okay, so that's the first layer of dots in place, and I can now start to build upon them and refine them further. So here I'm going in with another highlight layer using the Caran 35 ochre, which we previously used, and mostly focusing on where those lightest yellow dots are, so especially to the left side here where they're catching the light. I'm just gradually building up the layers, essentially going from dark to light, just really trying to focus on where the light and dark values are, and then matching them to my reference image as best I can. We can't also forget about the dark values here, so I'm going back in with the Faber-Castell Dark Grey 175 just to further enhance that dark central area, and then I'll switch to using the light yellow Carbothello 692 as my final highlight pencil for some of these brightest dots. Again, just building upon the previous dots and brightening their value even further. Okay, so I'm relatively happy with that central area and all of the rich texture that we have in place there. And now I'm just going to add a final layer of subtle vibrancy to the petals by using the Conte Paris 14. So again, just lightly shading in on top where I can see those lightest values in the reference image. And as long as I keep a light even pressure, these light yellow pigments will mix in with what's already there rather than cover them. And the reason I chose this pencil is because the Conte Paris are very vibrant and opaque, so they're perfect for this final refinement. So as I've already mentioned in the intro, for this second flower the method involves outlining with a graphite pencil. And here you can see I'm using a 4H pencil, which is important because we want a harder graphite core for this rather than a soft graphite core. If you were to use a 2B, 4B or 6B graphite pencil for example, you're just going to be left with big black outlines which will show through the pastel. Using a pencil such as this 4H one that I have here, you can barely see the graphite, but the lines will still be visible through the pastel layers, which is what we want. So as you can see, I'm just outlining all of the petals here using a light to medium pressure, just sort of scraping the paper. Again, you can hardly see the graphite, but that's great because once we come to fill in the base layer, those lines will be visible through the pastel layers. This works because the graphite makes it difficult for the pastel to adhere to the paper. So with everything outlined with the graphite, you can see I've started to fill in the pastel base layer using my soft pastel sticks. I first used the Schmincke 97D Serious Black just to sort of outline the dark central shadow area where the middle meets the petals, and then I'm filling all over with the lovely purple Unison colour BE24. On top of this purple, I'm also adding in pigments into the mixture with the vibrant Schmincke 48B. I'll then quickly re-enhance that dark central area with the 97D again, and finally I'll also complement the colour with vibrant reds also near around the inner centre, and this is using the Schmincke 43B. So with all of those colours in place, I can then take my soft sponge tool with a clean sponge head to blend all of these pigments out. Remember, with this method we're not going to create any detail or definition in the base layer, just a sort of flat area of vibrant colour which we will then create all of the refinements with our pencils afterwards. So for this method, the base layer is the starting point for our pencils to do all of the hard work. As we blend the pigments, you can see those petals are outlined from the graphite where the pastel had a hard time adhering to it. We can still see the correct positioning of everything through the base layer, which is really helpful. So I'm just continuing with my soft sponge tool here, using the tip for more precision, but just really aiming to smoothen everything out to give me a soft and blurry base layer to work upon. I don't want any harsh lines or edges in this base layer. I can also just quickly use my fingers here to soften the pigments out further to create a subtle blurring effect. When we blend the pigments out with the soft sponge tool, it can often make the colours less vibrant, so I'm just going back in with both the 48B and 43B Schmincke pastel colours and using the sponge transfer method to re-enhance these vibrant colours before we commit to our details. Again, I love to make sure that my base layer is perfect before my pencil details go on top, just because it's much easier to have the correct colours now rather than trying to correct them later on. So the first thing I really want to do when I start with my pencils on top is just to sort of map out the area. So here you can see I've got my black Caran pencil and I'm just first creating that dark shadow around the central area, and I'll also be drawing in between some of the petals for those deep shadows that we can see in the reference. For some of the other surrounding petals and other dark areas, I instead opt to use the dark grey Faber-Castell 175 just because I think the black in some of the particular areas would be a bit too dark and intense, so this Faber-Castell is a great alternative. So I'm just quickly continuing here to fill in some of these other shadows, especially in the corners where we can see that the petal goes behind the others in front. And as we start to get a contrast in the values, that 3D depth will start to emerge. Okay, so let's now start with refining some of the colours and highlights on top of this generic base layer. So first I'm going to use both the pink Caran 583 as well as the pinky purple Carbothello 642. Again, I'll be working in multiple layers, so this is just a first pass which we will build upon. As I mentioned, the Carbothello are great for general use as they're sort of in between being soft and hard and therefore have a medium level on the opaque scale. Whereas the Caran are very soft and therefore very opaque, so I'll use the Carbothello for some of the areas that I want to be more subtle, and then I'll switch to the Caran for when I want brighter and more intense colour. So first here I'm essentially just outlining the edges of the petals, and thanks to the graphite outlines we can still see their correct positioning. I'm highlighting not only the edges, but also some areas of the tips of the petals where I can see them catching the light in the reference image. Okay, so here I'm starting with the more intense Caran and I'm opting to use this pencil here because we can see the light is catching the most here in the reference image. You can see that some of the tips of the petals are really highlighted and they're almost a light grey colour with maybe a hint of pinky purple in there. So again, working in layers, I'm going to just use this intense pink pencil for those lightest areas, and then in future layers we can go on top with even brighter pencils, such as maybe some light greys for those lightest areas. So as long as we continue to use a light even pressure for all of our layers, the different colours will mix and combine together so that each layer plays a role. This is still an early stage of the drawing process as I'm still just figuring out where to place my highlights and just trying to first map the correct shape and positioning of all the petals before I commit to those brighter and lighter colours on top in future layers. So I'll just continue here for the next couple of minutes to finish drawing in the first layer of highlights with these two pencils. Okay, so I now have that first layer of highlights down and I can start to refine and better incorporate these pigments together. So here I'm using the Faber-Castell 194 to lightly shade in on top with the aim of softening the highlights into the base layer. Again, by using a light even pressure, this pencil will not only deposit these lovely pinky pigments into the petals, but also help to soften and blend those highlight layers together. As I've already mentioned, the more light even layers of pastel we put in place, the more the area will become smoothed and softer, and you'll also see that grainy texture start to disappear. To ensure that I'm using a light even pressure, you can see that I'm holding my pencil a bit further back, and this just allows me to sort of just let the tip gently glide along the surface, and it also allows me to have a good view of where I'm shading in. Also, a sharp tip is another really important aspect when it comes to smooth shading layers, as you could imagine having a blunt pencil and how jagged and unneat that shading would be, so I always like to make sure I have a sharp pencil for this. So here, as I mentioned previously, we can start to use a light grey highlight pencil, as in the reference image, the highlighted sections of the petals, especially you can see on the tips and the edges, is very highlighted to almost a light grey colour with some pinky undertones. So here I'm using the light grey Carbothello 720. Again, with a sharp tip, I am shading in all of those light areas where the light is hitting the most, and just basically going back and forth the reference photo and seeing which petals and what sections of those petals have those lightest values. I don't want to cover what's already there, I just want these light grey pigments to mix in with the layers underneath, so I'm not going to press too hard, but rather just use a sort of medium pressure for this, as we can see the light grey colour is the most obvious in the reference photo. But we still want those pinky undertones, so I'm not going to press too hard. If I did choose to press really hard here, it is likely that the petals will just turn this light grey colour, sort of covering and blocking any of those pink undertones that we worked hard to create. So looking at the reference photo, we can see that these petals I'm working on here to the right side of the flower still have that light grey tone, but they're not bright and intense as the light isn't hitting them as much on the left side. So for these petals in particular, I will just ease off the pressure even more, so I'll use a light pressure here, and so by using this light pressure with my pencil, less of this light grey pigment will deposit into the mixture and therefore giving a more subtle highlight, replicating what is seen in the reference image. Of course, the overall tips of the petals are highlighted, but we also have some dips and grooves which give the petals their texture and shape, so I'll make sure to draw those highlight details in too. Just like how we did with the 194, here I'm using the Faber-Castell 225, which you can see is this lovely pinky red pencil, and I'm again just drawing in between some of the highlights and the mid-tone areas of the petal to better incorporate them together. Again, the pastel will smooth and the pigments will become more incorporated. Here I'm again just quickly using the 194. So after better incorporating the highlights into the other layers, you can see that more of the pinky tones have been added and the light grey highlights have become a little less bright. So I'm just again going to refine and enhance those light grey highlights, sticking with the Carbothello 720. It may seem a bit repetitive, but all the layers work together with light even layers. I like to take a slow and gradual approach to build up the detail and definition through the layers, so this is all part of the step-by-step process. I also find it to be quite therapeutic and enjoyable, which is obviously a huge bonus. So I think everything is looking great so far and we're close to our final layers, but when looking back and forth the reference photo, I think I might just be missing some red vibrancy. So here I'm using the Conte A Paris 39. Again, this brand is very opaque and vibrant, so I need to make sure to use the lightest pressure as I only want to subtly add these pigments in. I'll mainly add them to the mid-tone areas of the petal, so not where the light grey highlights are, but rather the deep red and purple colour area of the petals. Here I'll again just quickly enhance some of those light grey highlights. I'm just basically looking back and forth the reference image and comparing the values, so how light or dark my highlights are. And here I can notice that some of the tips of the petals could have an even lighter value. So I'll be using a light to medium pressure and just building upon what I've already previously done. So now I'm just going to begin my final refinements and details. So here I'm first taking a sharp black Caran pencil and just refining the outer edges of some of the petals and filling in any gaps that I haven't already filled yet. I'll also just spend the next minute or so continuing with the pencils I've already been using, just to enhance the highlights and vibrancy even further before moving on. So here I'm just actually quickly switching back to the Caran light pink, which we previously used in the first layers, just because in the reference image I can see that some of the more subtle highlights have these lovely pink tones. So I'll use this pencil in some of these more subtle highlighted and shaded areas, and also to enhance some of these subtle details, such as to the edges of some of the petals as well, just where we see that those highlights are still light but not overexposed to that light grey colour. Okay, so I'm happy with how the petals are looking and I'm now ready to move on to that central area. So first I'm taking a kneadable eraser just to lift up some of those purple pigments in the very middle so that I can then refill it in with some of the green colour that I can see in the reference image. Here I'm using the Faber-Castell Green 165. So just like how we did with the previous yellow flower, I'm going to start adding in these dots on top of the base layer for that texture that we can see in the center, and I'm doing this using the light pink Faber-Castell 124. Again, mainly just focusing on how big to make these dots and what sort of a gap to leave between each one, and then I can work in more layers on top to pick out some of the highlights that I can see as well. And as the Faber-Castell are a harder brand of pastel pencil, I'll just make sure to apply a bit more pressure so that these marks are nice and vibrant on top of that base layer. So to pick out a few of the highlights on top, I'm going in with the Caran Light Pink 583, and I'm just simply looking back and forth the reference image and seeing which of these dots have those lighter values. I'm not going to highlight every single dot, but just a select few that I can see are the brightest in the reference image. And lastly here, I'm just again taking my black Caran pencil, adding in some of the dark texture marks in the middle, and I'll also add some highlighted texture marks as well using a light grey. I personally chose not to make it as vibrant green as I see in the reference image, and that's just a personal choice, but feel free to make yours a vibrant green or any other colour that you wish. So this final flower method is all about pastel pencils. We're not going to be using any soft pastel sticks or sponge transfer methods, but rather just diving straight in with only the pastel pencils. First up here, I'm taking a sharp dark brown, and this is the Faber-Castell 176. I'm first mapping out the flower by focusing on the darkest areas and shadows, again mainly just working from dark to light. The reason I've chosen this brown pencil is because the shadows here have a warm tone to them which the brown colour supplies. It also helps to have a sharp tip for this because you can see in the reference this flower is very detailed and there is a lot going on here. I thought this final method would be useful for you to see a pastel pencil exclusive way of drawing, just to see if you think you may prefer to only use pencils and skip the soft pastel sticks altogether. So as I'm mapping out these darkest areas first, you can see that it's allowing me to almost outline and section off certain parts, and this just helps to get the whole area organised before we start shading in. Alright, so I'm happy with the mapping out of some of the darkest sections for the flower here, and sticking with this same brown pencil, I'm going to begin shading into the left side here. Again, we will be working in multiple layers, so this is just sort of a first pass where I'm starting to get these darker values in place. Again, making sure to use a light even pressure for smooth even layers. If at all you're confused about what sort of colours to aim for, again it's really handy to use a colour picking tool. You can see on the reference that the flower appears white and a light grey overall, but we have those distinctive yellow colours for some of the mid-tones, mainly where the shadows and dark values are. So for these tones I'm using the Faber-Castell 180. And using this pencil I can not only shade in these yellow pigments, but also mix and combine them with some of the previous dark browns that we put down. So I'm essentially mixing and combining the two colours together. The first dark brown helped with that deep dark value, and then this yellowy brown on top is helping to shift the tone to a more accurate colour as I see it in the reference image. Again, we can just keep working in multiple layers to tweak and adjust things as we go along. Okay, so the petals themselves are a neutral colour, I would say overall a light grey, but they have different tones which are both cool and warm. So for these cool tone areas, I'm going to be shading in with a grey, and this is with the Carbothello 708. It looks a little too dark at the moment, but we will brighten the value in further layers on top. This is just to give us a starting point. I find that building layers up from dark to light works much better than if you go straight in with a light pencil, for example, and this is mainly because you'll be met with graininess issues and also it could look flat. For some of the petals over here that I can see have a warmer tone to them, instead of using the grey I can opt to use a brown for the first layer for those warm tones, and this is with the Carbothello 625. As I've said, I can refine and adjust as I go along, so here I'm just enhancing some of those darkest brown areas before moving on and committing to these lighter yellow colours. Again, just building up those layers. So the pencil I'm using here is the Bruynzeel 48, and I'm just simply going to lightly shade on top of what we've already drawn in here, just focusing on the reference image and seeing where those yellow tones are. I'm not going to worry about all of the fine detail at the moment, as I will add all of that in some of the final layers, but this is just about getting the correct values and colours in place beforehand. So moving back to the petals here, on top of those darker grey pigments, I'm also going to go in with some of this light neutral grey, and this is with the Carbothello 704. Again, light even layers on top to mix and combine the layers together so that we can gradually build up the value and structure. Here I'm just going to use the Carbothello 708 again to smoothen out the layers and also to add some more grey into the mixture. Here I'm also going to smooth out some of the browny yellow areas by using again the Faber-Castell 180. Okay, so now I'm ready to start work on the petals and bring them up to that light value. So first here I'm using the light neutral grey from Carbothello, and this is the 720. On top of these light grey pigments, I'm also going to shade in with the Carbothello 704, which we just previously used, and this will act as a sort of mid-tone. So if you look in the reference image, you can see that this petal in particular is darker to the left side, and then it's catching the light more to the right side. So these slightly darker neutral tones from this pencil will be focused mostly in the middle, but also used to help to blend and smoothen the whole area out. Mostly to the left side here, I'm also using this neutral grey, and this is the 706 from Carbothello, just gradually building up the layer here. You'll see that we've added those lighter pigments on top, so some of those dark values that we first put in to the left side here have been toned down, so I'm just going to enhance them again by using the same pencil we first used, which is the 708, just like gradual shading on top. Here I'm also re-adding in some of those subtle yellow tones to the shadow, and now I'm going to use my final brightest highlight pencil, and this is the Carbothello Light Grey 700. I'm going to focus these brighter pigments mainly to the right side where we see the light catching the most, but also some of the texture marks in the middle of the petal as well, just so that it doesn't look flat without any definition. So as I work to refine these two petals here, I'm thinking about the subtle tones that I can see within them. I can see a mix of cool blue tones and also some lovely faint purpley tones as well. So for the next minute or so, I'm just going to quickly use both the cold grey Carbothello 724 for those blue colours and also the Caran 93 for the purple. I'll be shading on top of what I've already got down, so it's really important that I use the lightest of pressure to only slightly add these colours in. Whether I'm working on these flowers or an animal portrait, for example, I love to study the reference image and see what interesting and beautiful colours that I can include into my artwork. The trick is to keep them subtle so that the image remains realistic, but even so, these subtle tones definitely add a lot of life to the piece. So I'm just going to finish these petals off here by adding in these final highlights using the Carbothello 700. So you can see at the tip of the petal the light catching, so I can just add these fine highlight lines in here, and now these are in, you can just see how effective they are already, and I can also add some very slight texture marks in place to this petal too. And now I'm just going to do the exact same process to this other petal to the left here before moving on. Okay, so now with the light grey Carbothello 720, I'm going to shade in some of the highlights where I can see the light catching in the reference for these petals to the left here. I'll then soften the transition from the dark inner shadows to these highlights using the neutral grey 706. I'll also use the same pencil to refine the petal here before we commit to those lighter highlights for the tip. And to lighten the value of the tip here, I'm using the Carbothello 700. And I'll also do the same for the other petals to the left here too. Okay, so moving back over to the petals on the right side of the flower here, I'm going to continue shading in with different greys to build up the mid-tone. So not thinking too much about the highlights here because they'll come in at the end, but I'm just refining the base colour before the highlights go on top. So here I'm shading in on top lightly with the Carbothello 720. Here I'm just quickly adding in some more yellow tones with the Bruynzeel 48 again. So continuing with the petals, I'm also going to shade in light gradual layers with both the Carbothello Cold Grey 720 and also the 706. The combination of all these light layers will slightly mix and combine together to give me something that closely resembles what I see in the reference image. So I'm essentially just mixing and combining the colours available to me just to try and best match the particular tone and value that I can make out in the reference. So I think that's quite a good mid-tone for this area at the moment. It's quite hard to tell with the grey colour of the paper right next to it, but when we come to add in the highlights in a bit, you'll see it all come together. So a lot of this just has to do with trust in the process, and I would say that experience definitely helps with this. Okay, so for the next couple of minutes or so, I'm just going to refine these small petals here in this area. So repeating much of the same process which I've already explained. So I won't bore you with explaining it all over again, but I do think that it's useful to keep watching other examples of the same thing just to really reinforce the methods and techniques. Okay, so now let's move back to the main petals to the right side here, and as I explained previously, the highlights will be at the very end, which is now, and you'll see that everything will start to come together. So I'm going to be highlighting with both the Carbothello 720 and 700 greys. So in particular, I can see that the edges and the tips of the petals are catching the light the most in the reference, so that's where I'll focus most of these highlights. And I can also refine some of the darker midtones as well as I'm adding in these highlights, just by using some darker pencils with a very light pressure, and that will subtly help to refine the area as well to aid those highlights. But again, it's much easier if you don't think about drawing petals themselves, but just simply following the reference photo and seeing what areas are lighter and darker. And then all you have to do with your pencils is just to make the particular shapes that you can see. So for example, the highlights of these petals are sort of curved and bending, so I will just draw in those curved and bending lines. It might all seem a bit random up close, but once you step back, the realistic image will start to take shape. So as well as drawing in shapes and lines, I can also lightly shade in with this pencil, as I can see in the reference that the inner corners of these petals have a lighter value, so I'll just quickly add that in here. As I'm working through the area, I'll just quickly refine these small petals here towards the center. So I'm using different greys to build up the layers and the values, and also using a brown to keep the edges and the outlines sharp, and also to separate any petals where need be. So again, there is a lot going on in this area for the flower, so on top of that darker base colour layer that we've got down in place, I can take this lighter grey and start to add in the petals here that look like small abstract shapes up close. So sticking with the Carbothello 720 here, I'm just going to continue lightening some of the other values and also better incorporating some of these darker midtones here as well. So for the petals at the top here, I can see a slight underlying tone of a very subtle purple, so I'll lightly add these pigments into the mixture with the Caran Violet Grey 93. I'll also very lightly add these subtle purple tones to some of these petals to the left side here as well, mostly to the shadowed areas where I can see those underlying purple colours. Okay, so you can see that that bright central area is still blank at the moment, but I'll now go in with a first layer, and this is with the Carbothello 720. Again, this is a first layer which we will build upon with light gradual layers. As this central group of petals falls behind the others in front, we can see that darker shadow value in the reference image. So for these colours and tones, I'm going in with the Caran Grey 808. Again, just lightly shading on top in circular motions, blending into that first layer of light grey to incorporate the sections and begin to smooth everything out. We can see a lot of subtle but fine detail within this area as there's a lot of small petals all next to each other. But first here we're just getting the overall general value and colours in place, and then we'll worry about the fine details at the end. So mostly here I'm just refining this base layer for the highlights to go on top of. So I need to make sure that this area is a mid-tone area that is dark enough for those highlights to contrast against. So I don't want to make this base layer too light, because it will be difficult to see the final highlights on top at the end. And of course this flower has those lovely yellow colours within some of the mid-tone areas, so here I added more of the Bruynzeel 48, and now I'm also going in with the lighter Carbothello 692. Hopefully you can see just how light of a pressure I'm using, and that's hardly any at all, just so that this bright pencil only subtly adds these yellow pigments in, as I don't want it to be too intense for the area. Here I'm now just enhancing some of the highlights for the surrounding petals again using the 700 Carbothello, and I'll also use this pencil to highlight the outer central petal tips that are contrasted against the dark shadowed inner section. Again, I can highlight on top some of these small abstract shapes here where the small petal tips are just catching the light. And I'll also start to do the same for the mid-tone area that we've just put in as well. So here, after I've added in some of these highlights, you can see why the base layer for this mid-tone area needs to be dark enough so that these highlights can go on top. So if the base layer was too light in value, for example, then these highlights that I'm putting down now would not contrast against that base layer and would just sort of blend into it instead. As I'm working through the highlights, I'm also enhancing those deep darker yellow tones that I can see within this area using the Faber-Castell 180. So here I'm actually opting to use the white Carbothello sparingly, just to lightly brighten some of these central petals even further. I don't want to make the petals look white, but I'm just using this white pencil to push those light values a little bit more. So again, it's important that I only use a light pressure to not overdo it. Here again, just enhancing some of those midtones and lightly adding in the subtle purple pigments using the Caran 92. So continuing with the refining, I'll keep adding in these yellow tones into my mixture with the Bruynzeel 48. I'm just constantly looking back and forth the reference image and comparing my values and tones, and here I can see that I need more yellow in the area. Here I'm using the Faber-Castell 169, which you can see is this deep dark purpley red, just in some of these really dark shadowed areas to enhance that deep warm colour that I can see. Of course, it really helps to use a sharp pencil for these fine detailed areas. Just like how we did with the petals on the right side, I'm also going to enhance some of these darker midtones in this area to complement those highlights. This pencil is a bit too dark for this area, so I'll lightly go on top and soften it with the Carbothello Light Grey 720. I'll also just stick with this same pencil to soften the gradient from the lighter highlight area at the tip of the petals to the slightly darker midtone here. So I would say that we're very close to the end here, so for the next 5 minutes I'll just be adding all of the final details and upping the realism as much as possible before we finish. So here with this light grey, I'm just softening some of the gradients for the petals, and I'm also going to continue adding in those small abstract shapes for the tips of the petals here that are just catching the light in that central area. Again, not thinking about drawing actual petals, but just simply focusing on the shape of these highlighted lines themselves. I'll continue to opt for a white pencil using a light pressure, just to brighten the value of some of the selected petal tips further than some of the others. And again, I don't want white tips, but this white pencil can help to brighten the value to an even lighter grey, for example. I'll also keep reinforcing the yellow and darker mid-tone colours for some of the shadowed areas as well, again using just a very light pressure just to make these subtle changes. And again for the darker shadowed areas between some of the petals, and especially in that shadowed central area, I can keep enhancing with the Faber-Castell Dark Yellow 180, as well as that deep dark red that we previously used, the Faber-Castell 169. You'll notice in the very centre we have more of those small tips of the petals that are just catching the light, those little abstract shapes, and as we get further into that dark central area, the value drops and those highlights appear more of a yellow colour. So here I'm adding in those details using the Bruynzeel 48, and I'll also go on top of some with the Carbothello 692. Okay, so I'll just spend the next few minutes continuing to be extra picky, adding in these last final refinements, enhancing both the highlights and some of the midtones using the same methods before moving on. So in conclusion, all three methods are a great choice for drawing flowers. For me personally, the second method with the graphite pencil outlines is my favourite, just as I found it to be the quickest and easiest. The third method with only the pastel pencils definitely took the longest out of the three, but I also love the precise control it allowed me, especially for a very detailed flower such as the final one. Obviously, you're able to use different methods for different flowers, so for a very detailed flower where it would be easier to draw details straight away, the third method of just using the pastel pencils alone may be best. But for the majority of the work, I think that methods 1 or 2 might be more to your liking. So for me, method 1 was a little tricky as I found it to be difficult to be accurate in the base layering stage, but that may just be because I personally keep the base layer quite basic and generic in my practice anyway, similar to the second method. Each of us are going to have different strengths, so I do think that it would be very useful to test out all three methods and just see which you may prefer to use, not only for this tutorial but for any soft pastel artworks moving forward. Thanks so much for watching my flower study snippet here on YouTube, and remember, if you would like to watch the full tutorial including help with the accurate outlines, how to choose the correct colours, and also a list of the specific materials used and much more, you can find the link to my Patreon in the description. On my Patreon, you'll also find many other in-depth soft pastel tutorials ranging from all sorts of different fur types to beautiful landscapes and seascapes, as well as rich and dynamic still lifes and much more. All of the lessons on my Patreon are available to watch instantly for a low monthly fee that you can cancel at any time that suits you. My website also has a page dedicated to showcasing all of the available lessons right now, so I'll also leave a link to that in the description if you're interested. Feel free to like this video if it's helped you in any way, and subscribe to stay tuned for future videos. This really helps out the channel and your support here means a lot to me. And before you go, feel free to pick up this free in-depth beginner soft pastel guide. Thanks so much again for watching here on YouTube, and I hope to see you in the next one.